First and foremost, let me thank Sarah for inviting me to be here. One of the students during the lunch interaction said the topic was very generic, so what exactly do I specialize in? I thought it was a good question. I said, well, in generalities. Because I said I don't do anything myself anymore, so everything that I will talk about is done by somebody else. And if you have a particularly difficult question, I'll take it back and ask the scientist when I get back and respond to you on that. But it really is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk broadly about Indian agriculture and how technology has been an instrumental part in growing the Indian agriculture, and at the same time also talk about the challenges that we face. So let me get this in my hands. So. And I'm not blocking the video by any chance, right? Okay, great. To start with, everyone is familiar with Green Revolution, and I thought I will put this slide up to put things in perspective as to where we were in the 60s when the seeds of Green Revolution started coming to India, and where we are today. And the situation is, of course, dramatically different. So we're 400 odd million people. In the 60s, now 1.12 billion. We had severe shortage of food grain. Many described the situation in the 60s as the ship-to-mouth existence. So if the grain came from the US or Canada or from Mexico, there would be food to distribute amongst the population. The government at that point of time actually asked people to skip one meal a week so they would have enough food grain to serve the population with the. So that was the situation. And I want to, our productivity, of course, was not very high, and it still remains an issue. But the one key thing which was present then was because of the real situation that was on the ground, there was a significant commitment from the political leadership to see that technology comes, and that's when the Green Revolution seeds came. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation brought in technologies to improve agriculture. And private sector was just starting, so our company, for instance, started in 1964 and started with selling improved variety of okra, which is a very popular Indian vegetable, and then also produced hybrid maize seed, which the Rockefeller Foundation had brought. This was even before the seeds of the Green Revolution actually had been planted in the North and Northwest. So if we look at that and look at today's situation, and one drastic change is that we have abundance of food grain now. India was the second largest exporter of wheat, I think, last year. Maybe the largest exporter of rice until a few weeks ago. Maybe Vietnam has now become again the largest exporter of rice. And so we've seen, despite our ups and downs in terms of the weather and so forth, we had a severe drought, but we still have enough food. The problem with having enough food is that there is a lot of complacency in the political circle. Nobody wants to talk about how to improve productivity. The bigger problem they have is the criticism that the government has as to how is this food being stored. So the issue of the grains getting damaged, the post-harvest losses, which is a bigger concern for the politicians than making sure that we continue to invest in agriculture and that our productivity continues to grow. We have a large private sector presence in the country now. And not just the Indian private sector, but you have all the global private sector operating in the country. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the changes that have happened in the Indian agriculture. So if you look at the high-yielding varieties, everyone thinks about the Green Revolution and thinks about rice and wheat. And yes, those were two major crops which actually came during the Green Revolution to India, but simultaneously through the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations came sorghums, came maize, came vegetable seed production practices, and so forth. So what we've seen is the high-yielding varieties, which really changed the grain availability situation. We have hybrids in a large number of crops. Crops where, if cotton is an example, where India is probably one of the few countries which is all under hybrid cotton. Globally, you will see that it's all varietal cotton. So, which has resulted in productivity gains. We have a significant seed replacement rate, which is indicative of the quality of seed that the farmer plants. And planting material is critical when it comes down to what is the production that the farmer is likely to see. We have significant gaps in legumes and other self-pollinated crops. And this point actually relates to my last point there on IP. One of the main reasons why we didn't make as much progress in chickpea or pigeon pea or in groundnut, all of these crops, there's no intellectual property regime in the country in those days. And only recently we have plant variety protection laws which have come about, and also other mechanisms by which we can protect parts of the intellectual property. So the focus of the private sector remained on working on crops which could be easily hybridized. And you'll see that all the crops, the sorghum, the millet, which saw significant improvement in productivity, were all because of hybridization and improvement in genetics. But we still have, today even, we have significant shortage of legumes. And India is a vegetarian country with 50% or more of people dependent on plant protein sources, has the largest expense in terms of food imports on legumes. So we are getting legumes. Pigeon pea is grown in Australia specifically for the purposes of export to India. We're getting peas and so forth from Canada and the US. So we hopefully we will have a change in this particular situation. The government is very keen. And the other large deficiency we have is in the oilseed sector. So you see a severe shortage. India has a large oil consumption, but still we have the capacity to produce it, but we're not able to compete in the global market. We have a lot of new technologies which are being worked on in India, and I will give you some examples of that. We also look at seed treatments as a way of delivery of traits, possibly as an alternative for genetic modification as one of the tools in the toolbox. So the intellectual property still remains a major challenge in India. Agriculture is considered a state subject. 60% of the population is engaged in agriculture. So it's a very politically driven, election-driven approach to agriculture. So that is a concern that remains. When we think about Indian agriculture, and most of you would be familiar that the food grain basket, for instance, is this area, the bread bowl, what one calls Punjab, Haryana, Eastern UP, Western UP, would be where the largest of the rice and wheat production happens. I wanted to put this up because it's an interesting projection of where we are in terms of food insecurity and the environment sustainability. One of the challenges with the Green Revolution was that we had new genetics which responded to fertilizer and better agronomic practices and irrigation, and you had increase in productivity. Now that has also led to, if we look at this area now from an environmental sustainability index in the 2000s, that these areas which were the highest productive areas are the ones which are least environmentally sustainable. So water and salt are two major issues. When you see the state of Punjab, for instance, in the last 2 years is now asking farmers not to grow rice because of the salinity. There's no groundwater that can be used for irrigation, and in India we are growing primarily paddy, so you're transplanting and flooding the fields. So there is a shift, and the question then the Indian agriculture has to address is that how do we change our agricultural practices and the crop mixes that we grow in different areas to address the sustainability issue while addressing the production and productivity gains that are required as we go forward. Another question which was raised in during the lunch, which I thought was very interesting, relating to the post-harvest losses. At the World Food Prize, there was a big debate on post-harvest losses, and the theme or the message that was being communicated by very senior leadership was that if we took care of post-harvest losses, we don't have to worry about productivity. Now, that is a question which I wanted to raise here, because it's while post-harvest losses could be as high as 30%, you'll never go down to zero post-harvest loss, because cost of getting that would be almost impossible or not be worth it, definitely. So what would the 25% savings of the post-harvest losses address your production and productivity needs? And at least my calculation simply says that would not happen. So while we need to address that and continue. So what we have is the challenge of how do we produce that 40-odd million hectares of rice that we have in India if you're not growing it in the traditional manner of flooding and transplanting? How do you ensure that you still have the same production? And very simply, if I say that we move to a direct-seeded rice system, that means the first thing I need is weed control. If I don't have weed control, I cannot have a direct-seeded rice system, which will require less water and give me the same production. And in the Indian political scenario, we have tremendous resistance for deploying technologies which are potentially considered labor replacing, because the view of the politician is that we have so much labor, we have 1.12 billion people, so we should have enough people who can weed all of these plots. And but the challenge is that when you want the labor, there is no labor available. The cost of employing the labor is also gone up so dramatically that it's become almost impossible for you to do it. So there needs to be a significant change in the thought process when we look at this. So keep this in mind, because it's an important area that the Indian agriculture will have to continue to address as we go forward. If we look at what have we achieved, and so here's a hybrid wheat production field. We have the issues of environmental sustainability, particularly in the north. We still continue to have significant productivity gaps. So if you look at the top 7 Indian crops and look at productivity ranks globally, we would maybe the highest in the area under the crop, but in terms of productivity rank, we might be 30, 15. In few cases, we might be in the tens or single digits. So we have significant need for improving. And part of that, of course, can be addressed by agronomy practices, which so all the developing countries, for instance, we are focused on precision agriculture, when we fertilize, when we water, when we treat the crops for whatever the challenges may be. In India, we're still following that you'll fertilize at 30 days, you'll fertilize at 90 days, regardless of the stage of the crop. So we have significant opportunities at looking at how do we improve the agronomy on that. I want to move to 3 different examples of what has happened since the Green Revolution. It's a little busy chart, but I just wanted to illustrate how. So if we think about the tremendous improvements in productivity that happened with the Green Revolution and introduction of new dwarf varieties, BT cotton in India has done that again. We've almost doubled our productivity in cotton. It's the fastest adoption of any technology in agriculture in India. The crop was first introduced in 2002, and this year we have 95+% of the cotton acreage under BT cotton. The yields have doubled. Number of products which are available to the customer is a big basket of products from which the customer can choose. Number of companies in the green bars you see is a large number of companies who are providing the seed. The technology has also shifted that whereby instead of a single gene product, a shift to a 2-gene product, and this year we would have about 70% of the acreage would be under the 2-gene product. So in terms of insect resistance management, this is the strategy that we would go to and move to. And this has been a great impact in the cotton industry, whether it is the cotton farmer, the ginning mill which receives the fiber, the quality of the fiber has changed. The environmental impact in terms of reduction in pesticide use, so you have an overall active ingredient reduction of 45+%. And as I, oops, sorry. In the one argument which is there for a lot of the GM crops is that the small farmers are not the ones who benefit. But in case of, in our situation where all of our farmers are small, in 2009, for instance, 5.6 million 1 acre, 2 acre farmers grew this technology and benefited from it. So what we've been able to do with the BT cotton is the technology which has Cry1AC and Cry2AB in the 2-gene stack, addressing the chewing insect pests in cotton. But we still have a lot of other problems which exist, and we're not able to address those. And one major component of that is the sucking pest. So sucking pests, both from the ones which deliver the leaf curl virus, but then also just sucking pests in the central and southern zones, which cause a lot of damage on the plants in general. So the goal, one of the issues with the introduction of new technology in the early days is to manage the farmer's expectations. So if you provide BT product, the farmer thinks that it's going to address all the insect problems and sprays for nothing. And then after about 60 days, you realize, oh, the sucking pest problem has become a big issue. And then the first reaction is that the technology has failed. But the technology was never meant to control the sucking pest. So this is a challenge that we have, and one of the things that we have to look at as we look at technology product development in particular is managing the farmer's expectations and making sure that you have the pipeline of products which will address, because then the farmer's expectation of the next product to be superior to what you provided him is much, much higher now than what it had been with the traditional product. The other interesting thing which has happened with the introduction of BT cotton is that the plant type has changed. So I don't know if you, how many of you have seen a cotton plant in India, but the hybrids were grown in a 3x3 square, 3 feet by 3 feet square. So one plant in that much space, because the plant was a bush really with so many bolts on it with the BT cotton. And partly the reason for the bush was because all these insect damage buds were falling off, which led to a more vegetative growth pattern in the plant rather than focusing on producing the flowers. So in BT cotton, what you're seeing is the plant size is maybe half the size of what it was before. And so now the farmer still grows it at 3 feet by 3 feet. He sees big holes in the field. And so now you have to start working on a plant type which has different branching pattern, different way of flowering. And this also then relates to how, with the labor issues that we have, is that the cotton crop is going to be mechanized. As of today, it's still hand harvested. So when you think about mechanization, then again, you need a different plant type. So introduction of one technology has changed the industry as a whole, but then it's also changed the entire research focus as to how you look at a plant and what is the plant type that would be most desirable with that technology, which had not been our focus. So we introduced BT because it was great for insect control. But we did not, in those early days, think about how we should have modified the plant type to suit the agronomic needs which would be there. So this is a picture, a more recent picture now that even with the current plant type, the farmers are very keen to look at mechanization and how we can look at machine harvesting rather than hand harvesting. And of course, we don't have the plant type which reduces the residues in the harvest to the point where it's acceptable in the industrial use sector. So we really have to work on how we change this. The second example that I wanted to talk about a little bit is the BT eggplant, or brinjal as it is known in India. It's a very important vegetable crop in the country. And we have been working on, along with Cornell, in a public-private partnership mode to see how we can bring BT brinjal to different partners. Basically, there's a major insect, a fruit and shoot borer, which damages the shoot as well as the fruit. which leads to a tremendous reduction in the marketable yield of the crop. So the fruit number, of course, doesn't go up, but what is not damaged is changed. India is a great center for brinjal diversity. I was mentioning earlier to some people that every 30, 40 kilometers you have a preference for a different color, different shape, different size of the fruit. And so as companies work on this crop, our products are focused on catering to all of these segments, not just introducing a large purple-black eggplant, which will be popular with everyone. So why is it that we need control of this insect? You might be wondering, what is the 74 number in the middle of the slide? It is the number of sprays a farmer in West Bengal will undertake to control the insect. This is a farming family of 14 people or so in the state of Maharashtra. And you can see that they're actually standing in a soybean field, but they are a brinjal family. So they will grow their own consumption crop on the side, which they know they haven't sprayed. And the rest of the crop they will spray because they want to make income from it. The crop is 150-day-old crop from seed to maturity. So if you're spraying 74 times in a cropping season, that means you are spraying the crop every other day. And if you're spraying the crop every other day and the insecticide description says, wait for 5 days before you harvest the fruit, there is no 5-day window for the farmer to harvest the fruit. And the farmer is going to harvest the fruit at the right size. They're not going to wait if the size of the fruit is what is desired in the marketplace. So what you see is the tremendous pesticide residue, and that's of course the overriding need for why to address this. And conventionally, we've not been able to address it. There are no known sources of resistance for the fruit and shoot borer. So this is the reason why BT brinjal concept and the idea came about. So it's a very interesting partnership model. The partnership is between India, Bangladesh, and Philippines. In India, we have 3 partner institutes: the Tamil Nadu Agriculture University, University of Agricultural Sciences, Dharwad, and also the Indian Institute of Vegetable Research. And we have 2 partners in Bangladesh and 1 in Philippines. The idea was that we would generate one event which will be shared amongst the partners, and the partners would put it in their local varieties or hybrids and then provide it to resource-poor farmers or marginal farmers at a cost-plus basis, because they already sell seeds to these farmers. So the BT would be available not just in the hybrids, but also in the other varieties which might be grown. So this has been a very useful partnerships that we've had. We unfortunately have a political gridlock now, so we are stuck. But for now, we've completed the biosafety package for the product. All the studies required by the regulators have been completed. The scientific apex body in India called the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee has cleared it for biosafety, and then moved it on to the minister for approval. And then we are still waiting after 3 years for the minister to provide approval for that. So the unfortunate part in this whole process is that instead of being a science-driven process, we've now become a political process to bring new technologies in the country. So it's a challenge that we have, and we don't know when we will see the light at the end of the tunnel. I know there is light at the end of the tunnel. I just don't know when that's going to be. And I'm going to talk, share a couple of other traits that we are working on, but of course, us and many other companies and public institutions in India are working on the key challenges that Indian agriculture faces, whether it's drought, salinity. Fertilizer use is an important area that we are looking at, and then looking at how do we increase the intrinsic yield. I'll share one example on the nitrogen use efficiency. I think in the Indian context, the nitrogen applied per acre is much lower or suboptimum levels as compared to the developing countries and also to China. China probably has the problem of excess application of nitrogen in some of the growing areas, whereas in our situation we have not adequate supply of nitrogen fertilizer. As a greenhouse gas, nitrogen fertilizer, of course, has a significant contribution. So it's 298 times more potent, which I think most people don't think about, but that is the case. So if you think about reducing nitrogen fertilizer application and what contribution it has for greenhouse gases and as a result of it, possible climate change, then here's an opportunity to make crops more efficient in using nitrogen fertilizer. And without nitrogen fertilizer, there is no crop, right? So that is an important aspect to remember. So here's an example of the partnership that we have with Arcadia Biosciences in deploying nitrogen use efficiency in rice. And if we look at these two center rows, the null plant without the gene and the nitrogen use efficient rice plant, and leave aside the border rows for any other effect that might be, you can see immediately that you have much higher tiller number. If we look at them when they're harvested, again, you can see that the null row here and the nitrogen use efficient row, the number of tillers as one indicator of higher yield and biomass. If we look at the rice tiller data, again, it shows the lighter blue color is the nitrogen use efficient plants, number of tillers, and the darker blue is the null counterpart. So you see a significant increase in the number of tillers. I am not sharing the data right now for the panicle number or the 1,000 seed weight numbers, but again, those correlate also very similar to what we see with the rice tiller number. So all of these require field trial. We are yet to conduct a field trial because we don't have permission. The plants are ready to go. But as soon as all the indications show that with 30% less nitrogen application, you have 100% yield, or 100% nitrogen application, the yield advantage varies between 120 to 140, depending on the background that you have it in. So you can have a positive impact with deploying this kind of technology. I'm going to talk very little about molecular breeding because I think the audience knows a lot more on molecular breeding than I will be able to talk about. There's been a great push for having or utilizing molecular breeding tools in the breeding programs in the public sector and the private sector. The private sector is slowly investing because the investments required are quite large for most of us who are relatively small size private sector global players compared to the global players. So we're starting to make some investments in molecular breeding. The challenge that we faced was that we invested a lot first in the genotyping, but forgot about the phenotyping. And so as you make progress in the program, then slowly you realize, well, maybe we should have started with the phenotyping first and then gone to the genotyping. But anyway, so we're making progress on that, and I will share some information. And yesterday I was visiting with a number of faculty, and I was sharing with them that our biggest challenge is data. How do you manage the data? How do you analyze the data? And we don't have the expertise. We don't have enough expertise to be able to make the most of the data that we have. The other big challenge that we have is our costs. So if it costs you $1 here, it costs me $5 in India. So the only cheaper component for me is the human cost. But everything else is more expensive than what it is here. So when somebody says, Ed told me yesterday that it's $10 per sample, it will be $100 per sample for me if I were to do it in India. So these are some of the challenges that we have. So you have this technology, there's know-how and capability, but our ability to implement it at the large scale that we need is something we're still missing, and we need to make a move towards that. We also have some laws which make data transfer, transfer of germplasm, transfer of DNA, electronic data also impossible. So everything can come into India, but nothing can go out because we might lose some biodiversity or bioresource in the process. So it's very illogical. It's difficult to explain to these authorities, but this is another major restriction that we have. So I'm just going to, since I was talking about eggplant before, I thought I will talk about eggplant from our very, and as I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but we started doing very preliminary molecular data analysis on our germplasm to see what kind of diversity we have and how can we use that in our breeding decisions. So all the activities we are doing ultimately have to feed into our breeding program for us to have a effective product development process at the end of the day. So this particular eggplant, which is very popular in the north and northeast, we've had great challenges in developing or addressing some of the disease issues in this particular one. So what we have tried to do is to get all the germplasm available for that particular segment as well as others, and then try to begin the process of addressing how we can use molecular information to address our disease challenges. This is a project that we have ongoing for the last 6 years with the University of Delhi South Campus, and it is to look at developing and understanding the basis of heterosis in rice, and then how can we use this information for developing new hybrids in a faster manner. So this diagram really is nothing more than showing how when you put two different genotypes together, you have the mixing of the genotypes at different levels. And then at the end of the day, of course, we are wanting to look at all the alleles which have a positive effect on development or on the heterosis aspect. And so this is an ongoing project. We would, based on that, we have identified different genes which are expressed differentially in different tissues. So in particular, we find that in the young leaf and young root, you see significant differences between the parental and the hybrid expressions in many of these genes. The goal is to then validate these further based on the results, then to look at the interesting candidates and then use them in a molecular breeding program, or also then isolate those genes and see if we want to reintroduce them in the plant under different controls. So moving on to the last bit of my presentation, I talk about some of the key challenges. Recently, India has passed a food security law which mandates that the government will provide 5 kilos of rice, wheat, and coarse grain to 2/3 of the population at 1, 2, and 3 rupees cost. So it's 2 cents a kilo basically for rice, 4 cents a kilo for wheat, and 5 cents or so for coarse grain. So if you think about what production we have today, which is, of course, for today's needs, we have adequate supply. But when you think about what this food security law will entail, it'll become a public distribution system which is already present, but this will build on that. So our need for food grains will continue to grow up, not just because of our growing population, but also then the mishandling and so forth that will happen under this public distribution system. So how do you address that? So when we think about the challenges which are there for us today and what challenges will be there, I think we have a lot of work to do. I already mentioned that our biggest import bill in terms of foods would be in relation to the legumes, the pulses, and the oils. So we need to see how we can improve productivity of these, because these are still grown under large acreage. But particularly in the legumes, we lose 50+% of our crop due to insect pests, due to storage, and just due to not having appropriate agronomic practices because the farmers don't see it as a cash crop. So they are never sure, they will get a good price, but they are not sure if they will be able to compete with the imported grain price in this particular segment. So this is a major challenge. So unless we improve productivity of these crops, we will have a major issue. Policy is something that I have talked about during my, as I have gone along. So it is an environment, we don't have a facilitating policy environment, whether it is conventional agriculture or biotech. So we have a major challenge there. The focus in India seems to have shifted from agriculture to food. So the food security law, we have, by the way, elections coming up. So the food security law is a good voter bank tactic, one can say. So a food security law is enacted. We need to increase production, productivity, but nobody talks about agriculture, and the investment in agriculture are also very low. So if you think about the Indian Council of Agriculture Research, the largest public research body in the country, at least 5 companies individually invest more than what they have as their investment budget. So if their investment for the year is $600 odd million, I think Monsanto, Syngenta, Pioneer, Bayer Crop Sciences, BASF have more than that as their annual investment budget for maybe 2 or 3 crops. So the need for so there's no, because agriculture is not part of the discussion, food has become part of the discussion. It's all about the end product, but nobody's talking about how are you going to get that food. And this is a major concern that we have as it relates to investments in agriculture. So this is the problem. If during the harvest season, if you're driving down Punjab highway, you will see abundance of food. Stacks and stacks and stacks, vehicles waiting to unload at all of these procurement places. So the government really is not interested in talking about producing more. They are concerned about how do you store this and what happens. But we still continue to have malnourishment and hunger prevalent in the country. This is a very important crop, chickpea, which is probably 10, 11 million hectares, I think, could be wrong, but a large acreage. But 60% of the crop every year is lost to one single problem, and that's the pod borer that you see here. So it starts off with the egg laying, and then you see the larvae eating up, and then you see the large larvae feeding. So if you look at a branch with the pods on it, every pod will have a hole on it because the seed has been eaten up. And these are solutions which are readily available, including drought. Drought is a problem in this particular crop, so drought tolerance readily available, but there is no will of the government to invest in it. The private sector is not interested in it because they can't protect the variety. So the crop then is not making as much improvement as we can. So go back to the chart that I showed you first and focus on the environmental sustainability, because all the technologies that we are talking about, we want to make sure that the lessons that the good things that happened from Green Revolution and the lessons that we learned from the Green Revolution are not repeated as we look at new technologies which come to the marketplace. And then our big challenge is how do you change this area, which is the largest contributor to the grain basket, so that the other more sustainable areas take up that slack and go forward. So technologies are available. Policies are our biggest constraints. Cost of doing research and the product development cycle is so long that unless there is intellectual property protection, the private sector is not interested in investing in 10 years of research when the product is likely to come out if you don't have any assurance that your product will be protected at the end. So investment in research is something that is of great concern to us scientists, at least in the country, and we desperately need a facilitating environment to work in.